You want to know why I have a bug up my ass about the left more than I used to? It's like this. There's an ugliness they never used to have. The liberals I grew up respecting, none of them are like this. Democrats have become like a royal family that, because of so much incest, has unfortunately had children who are... I watched the evolution of both these guys. This didn't happen overnight. In 2022, before he owned Twitter, Elon tweeted this chart depicting how he felt about the liberal side having shifted so much that it left a basically liberal centrist like him now labeled a conservative. I related to the kind of mean girl you get from the cool kids in Wokeville when you're perceived that way. They tried real hard to cancel Rogan a few years ago. And when Elon hosted Saturday Night Live in 2021, well before he was a Trumper, some of the cast members gave him the cold shoulder for the sin of being rich. You think people don't remember when you do this to them? That it's not going to have blowback?
There comes a moment when someone who has long defended liberal ideals starts to look around and wonder what it all has turned into. And that seems to be exactly where Bill Maher finds himself now. Not just slightly annoyed or casually disappointed, but at a point of real frustration where patience has run out and things feel like they've crossed a line. And whether you agree with him or not, it is easy to see why this shift feels significant, because something about the current moment clearly stands out to him in a way that cannot be ignored before we go further. Make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation says a lot about the modern left that most mainstream discussions tend to avoid.
You lost everything. House, Senate, White House, Supreme Court, and left us completely unprotected and ready to be violated.
What makes Maher interesting is that he isn't a lifelong conservative jumping in to criticize Democrats. He's speaking from inside the same political world he has long been part of. He's not rejecting liberal values, but questioning how far the culture around them has drifted and why it no longer feels familiar to him. That matters, because when someone with decades on the left starts saying the movement has become smug, hostile, and out of touch, it reflects a concern many people quietly share but rarely say openly. It's less about ideology and more about tone, attitude, and how conversations are handled today. At the center of his criticism is the feeling that honest discussion has become harder, replaced by moral judgment, online outrage, and a constant sense of being talked down to instead of talked with.
What good is liberalism if you don't win elections? Last week, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton said, "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." Yes, there's the problem in a nutshell. Because Congressman Moulton sounds reasonable to me, but his campaign manager immediately resigned in protest. Let me make this as plain as I can to the smart people. The campaign manager who resigned, yeah, let that person go.
That's where the ugliness point really lands, because Maher isn't simply saying the left has become more progressive. He's arguing it has become sharper in tone, more punitive in attitude, and less focused on persuasion than on punishment and public shaming. And once that kind of culture takes hold, everything starts to feel different. Debate fades, curiosity shrinks, humor gets risky, and basic goodwill starts to disappear. It stops being about exchanging ideas and starts becoming about scoring points. At that stage, disagreement isn't enough anymore. People aren't just challenged, they're pushed out, shamed, or completely written off, sometimes along with anyone connected to them. And when that becomes the pattern, it starts to feel less like a political movement and more like a digital mob mentality.
By making too woke be a cancelable offense. It's important for America to have a center-left party, and for that party to be competitive. And a good first step toward that goal would be to make the voters not want to punch you in the face. I will conclude by saying the reason I'm so mad at the Democrats is because as a voter, the issues that were important to me were democracy and the environment. And now, there's no one to champion or defend either of them, because you, with your aggressively anti-common sense agenda and exclusionary attitude.
That's why figures like Joe Rogan and Elon Musk get pulled into this conversation, not because they're identical or beyond criticism, but because they're seen as examples of people who pushed back against the dominant online consensus. The argument is that neither started as clear enemies of the left, but gradually moved into opposition as the culture around them became more dismissive of disagreement. And in that view, backlash doesn't come out of nowhere. It builds from how people feel they've been treated, ignored, or publicly shamed over time.
I watched the evolution of both these guys. This didn't happen overnight. In 2022, before he owned Twitter, Elon tweeted this chart depicting how he felt about the liberal side having shifted so much that it left a basically liberal centrist like him now labeled a conservative. I related to the kind of mean girl you get from the cool kids in Wokeville when you're perceived that way. They tried real hard to cancel Rogan a few years ago. And when Elon hosted Saturday Night Live in 2021, well before he was a Trumper, some of the cast members gave him the cold shoulder for the sin of being rich. You think people don't remember when you do this to them? That it's not going to have blowback?
Politics often moves in pendulum swings where one side gains momentum, pushes its agenda strongly, and eventually triggers public fatigue that shifts things in the opposite direction. Most voters aren't looking for constant cultural lectures. They care more about practical issues like cost of living, safety, schools, and basic competence. That's why Maher's criticism stands out, because it isn't about rejecting liberal ideas, but about the belief that real issues got buried under cultural noise and online arguments that made everyday people feel talked down to instead of heard.
Because that's how politics works these days. One side gets elected precisely because the other side was just in power and pushed their agenda way too far and drove people in the opposite direction. The pendulum swings back and forth with people not voting for anything, but just to get rid of the latest extremists who tried to remake America in their image instead of just governing.
When a political movement starts prioritizing cultural signaling over basic, widely understood concerns, it creates a disconnect with ordinary voters. Issues that many people see as straightforward or reasonable suddenly become politically sensitive inside activist spaces, and that gap can feel confusing from the outside. The result is a culture where leaders become more focused on avoiding controversy than communicating clearly, and where speaking in plain terms can feel risky. Over time, that kind of environment can make politics feel more like performance than problem-solving, which is exactly when trust between voters and leaders begins to erode.
What good is liberalism if you don't win elections? Last week, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton said, "I have two little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." Yes, there's the problem in a nutshell. Because Congressman Moulton sounds reasonable to me, but his campaign manager immediately resigned in protest. Let me make this as plain as I can to the smart people. The campaign manager who resigned, yeah, let that person go.
That contradiction is what creates friction. You can't present yourself as the side of empathy while also coming across as punitive or overly judgmental in how you handle disagreement. And phrases like, "don't give me the ick" land for some people because they cut through political language and point straight at a gut reaction. A lot of this really comes down to perception and tone. It's not always about specific policies, but about how those ideas feel when they're communicated. Voters aren't detached analysts. They respond to energy, authenticity, and whether leaders seem grounded in reality. When that connection breaks, people don't need detailed arguments to walk away. If the message feels smug, disconnected, or performative, they'll reject it based on instinct long before they ever read a policy paper.
If you want to win my vote, don't give me the ick. You know what the ick is, right? It's a term mostly used in the dating world to describe that moment when one of the people, usually the man, does something so icky that the woman cannot forgive it or forget it. Like sending a pic or being mean to the waitress, paying for dinner with a coupon.
And this is where it gets even more damaging, because once a party starts losing culturally influential voices, it usually signals something deeper than a temporary political slump. Maher points out how Democrats keep trying to find their Joe Rogan, which is ironic for two reasons. It sounds engineered like a personality built in a focus group, and it ignores the fact that they already had access to figures like that before the culture hardened. The real issue isn't a lack of messengers. It's that the environment itself has become harder to speak in. When your own space becomes too rigid or self-serious to hold open conversation, you don't need a new spokesperson. You need to ask why the old one stopped feeling comfortable there in the first place.
Never too early to strategize. Democrats have been having a lot of donor retreats lately where liberal strategists hold ideathons, where they try to figure out why they keep losing elections. You know, apart from using words like ideathon. And now one idea that's getting a lot of attention is the Dems need to find their Joe Rogan, a liberal Joe Rogan, because that's why Kamala lost. Republicans have a podcast. Okay, maybe. Or you could consider this. Instead of conjuring up a new Joe Rogan, ask yourself why you lost the old one. Because he used to be on your side. He smokes pot on the air. I don't think he's that much of a far-right ideologue.
The same pattern shows up in debates around cancel culture, which is why Maher's frustration often feels less like a hot take and more like exhaustion building over time. There's a clear difference between criticism and coercion and between disagreement and intimidation. But in today's climate, those lines often get blurred in ways that feel intentional rather than accidental. When politics shifts into punishment instead of persuasion, people start pulling back. Comedians self-censor, commentators soften their words, and everyday conversations become more careful and guarded. A culture that claims to value open expression can end up producing the opposite effect when people feel like any misstep could carry public consequences. That's where examples like Cheryl Hines are often brought up, not as isolated incidents, but as illustrations of how quickly political disagreement can spill into personal pressure. The concern isn't just about one case. It's about a broader atmosphere where proximity alone can create guilt, and where public loyalty tests start replacing normal disagreement.
Cheryl Hines, who Larry David was quoted as describing as the best person I've ever met, the one person in Hollywood who doesn't have a single enemy. Well, now she does. Because she didn't throw her husband under the bus when her husband made a decision about something which she's made plain she disagrees with, but that didn't satisfy the obnoxious posers on the aforementioned far left. Thousands tweet screamed at Cheryl things like, "How do you live with yourself? Do better. I can't even enjoy the episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm with you in them anymore. It's no wonder Larry divorced you." Yeah, that's a character on TV.
Maher's point in this framing is that earlier generations of liberals were often defined by argument, protest, and challenging power, but still understood the importance of persuasion and pluralism in a democracy. The concern is that when disagreement turns into something closer to a loyalty test, it stops being about winning people over and starts being about enforcing agreement, which can come off as insecurity rather than strength. That's also where the backlash becomes harder to ignore. It's not just one political group reacting, but a mix of moderates, independents, older liberals, comedians, working-class voters, and even some progressives all noticing the same cultural shift and pushing back against it. When that kind of broad frustration builds, it becomes difficult to dismiss it as ignorance or bad faith. At that point, the issue isn't that large groups of people suddenly changed who they are, but that the movement itself may have lost some of its ability to self-correct. And that self-correction, recognizing overreach, adjusting tone, and acknowledging when something is alienating people is what keeps any political movement from drifting too far from the people it claims to represent.
The tweet that got the most attention was from actor Bradley Whitford, who wrote, "Hey, Cheryl Hines, way to stay silent while your lunatic husband throws his support behind the adjudicated rapist who brags about stripping women of their fundamental rights. Gutsy. Great example for the kids, profile and courage." Yeah, well, you know what I think is not gutsy? Mansplaining to a woman, but of course not to her face. How she should sacrifice her marriage. Also, you could read something on Twitter that met with your approval. You want to know why I have a bug up my ass about the left more than I used to? It's like this. There's an ugliness they never used to have.
Maher's complaint is that many Democrats recognize certain messages are politically damaging, and that parts of the activist culture can go too far. but instead of addressing it directly, they often avoid confrontation and hope it resolves itself. The concern is that this rarely works. Once ideas or behaviors take hold in a movement, they tend to expand rather than fade on their own. From that perspective, the criticism is that the party doesn't need to keep amplifying its most extreme or least relatable voices, nor rely so heavily on online validation as a measure of real public support. Instead, it could focus more on broadly shared priorities like the economy, safety, education, infrastructure, and effective governance, issues that tend to resonate across a wider coalition of voters. What makes Maher's position stand out is that it doesn't read like a full departure from the left, but more like disappointment from someone who still wants a functional, grounded center-left to exist. The frustration comes from the belief that this shift was avoidable and that the party has been weakened not by its core values, but by tone, priorities, and cultural overreach that alienate ordinary voters. In the end, his warning is less about one politician or one moment, and more about a broader political pattern. When a movement becomes too focused on internal approval and moral signaling, it risks losing connection with the people it depends on to win. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more content like this, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. Drop your thoughts in the comments too. Do you agree with Maher's take or do you see it differently? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.